If you want to learn about Patagonia and how to photograph it, you're in the right place. It's a pleasure to welcome back photographers and world travelers Marie Tarter and Steve Eilenberg to talk about their experiences photographing and traveling in Patagonia. Welcome back, you two.
Thanks, Kirby. Good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
My pleasure, for sure. Always excited to hear about your adventures. So Patagonia is an area, not a country, which I'm not sure everybody realizes. It's shared by Chile and Argentina. Why'd you choose the Chilean side?
Well, you're right that it is a very large area, but the majority is actually on the Chile side, and perhaps the most photogenic, although that's arguable, maybe the most famous portion of it, the Torres del Paine, is on the Chile side, and these mountains and towers are just absolutely magnetic and stunning, drop dead gorgeous. So there's probably a lot of wonderful beauty to be explored kind of outside the Torres del Paine area, but it is so stunning, gorgeous. It's hard not to focus on that area.
Yeah, that's true. And your point is well taken. It's about 1,000 miles long. It's like a cone-shaped area on the bottom of South America. So basically goes coast to coast. And I think there were 24 or so parks in the area. But when photographers talk about Patagonia, they're talking about
Torres del Paine, which is one of the national parks. And when you talk about those many national parks, those 24 national parks are just on the Chile side. So we've done 2 trips to this area, both times on the Chile side. I'm sure that there's a lot to like on the Argentina side as well. And at times when you're in Torres del Paine, you're actually only a few miles from the border with Argentina. So certainly there's attractions, I'm sure, on the Argentina side. But, as it happened with our other travel plans, sometimes in combination with trips to Antarctica, we have ended up combining this and staying on the Chile side.
And even in Torres, it's some hours to get from site to site. So it's such a big area that we will explore this time and time again, probably the same place.
Yeah, that actually is a point, even to, deciding where to, even if one is focusing on the Torres del Paine National Park, it's sizable enough that where you stay definitely has implications for how much drive time you are in for as you go from different parts of the park. So we've stayed in 2 different areas of the park on these 2 different trips, and it seems like almost no matter where you stay, maybe with a couple of exceptions, you are in for some longish drives to get from, like if you're interested in glaciers, you'll be going, more to the western side of the park to Great Glacier. Where if you're interested in wildlife, you're looking more at the northeast part of the park, which is a pretty good distances. Sometimes drive times of
several hours.
It could be up to 2 hours away, depending on exactly where you're staying. So obviously, if you're getting up for sunrise, you could have some pretty early calls.
Yeah, I gathered that from your blog post from your last trip.
Yeah. Well, that actually was during the month of February. So that's our winter, that's their summer. And that's probably when it is actually the worst in terms of the early rising. This last trip was during late March. So it was kind of early fall there. And it was definitely a little bit better in terms of not having to get up quite so early.
Probably a few hours difference.
Yeah, a couple hours difference.
So What's the best way to get there? It's a long ways from anywhere in the States for sure.
That's true. Well, as I mentioned, both times that we have gone, we've done this in conjunction with either going to Antarctica or going to other sites in Chile. And so both times we've gone by way of Santiago. And from there, well, it kind of depends on the day. Sometimes, so there are two airports that service the Chilean side of Patagonia. One is a lot closer, Puerto Natales, but it's a much smaller airport. It's only about an hour away from the southern part of the park, but it isn't serviced every day. But once in a while, depending on your travel plans, like this particular, sometimes you can fly directly into Puerto Natales and then you'll only be an hour away. But much more commonly is having to fly into Punta Arenas, which is about a 4-hour drive from the park. So unfortunately, that larger airport in Punta Arenas is serviced much more frequently. So, you know, it kind of, that situation is kind of dynamic. It's changing, but it seems like, you know, depending on the day you choose to travel, you may or may not have the closer option. In fact, this time we were able to fly into Puerto Natales, but we had to fly out of Punta Arenas. So,
but even the drive is gorgeous, so you're not wasting time really. The scenery is just beautiful either way.
The scenery is beautiful, but you know, obviously, I think, I don't know, when you're on your way to the airport, somehow, you know, the pressure of time doesn't make it feel like you can easily pull over and do photography en route unless you really plan for it.
Right. So you guys drove yourselves and did all your own arrangements, it sounds like, huh?
No, not actually. This latest trip that we did was actually planned originally around the eclipse of December 2020. So in that earlier version of the trip, we planned a 3-4 day stay in Chiloé Island, a 5-day stay in the Lake District, in which we would drive ourselves because we wanted to scout for a location to shoot the eclipse, and then a final 4 or 5 day stay in Patagonia. But obviously, you know, in December 2020, the pandemic was pretty much had shut down international travel. So we had to pick just a random future date to reschedule this trip, but we kept sort of the basic outline the same. Of course, we thought that, you know, March of 2022, the pandemic would be over, but of course it wasn't. But we, you know, by this time, of course, we were vaccinated and boosted. So we felt like, you know, it was a reasonable thing to do the trip.
Our first trip, we had a photo guide with us. And so we got the lodging and had a photo guide and driver. And the second trip, we chose a resort location where they had basically a program. You could select this or that hike. You go to this or that site.
It's one of these more or less all-inclusive places, which actually was wonderful. This is the latest place we stayed at was called Patagonia Camp, and is essentially a collection of about 20 yurts, which is not roughing it at all. It's definitely, I would say, the definition of glamping.
Fabulous food.
I mean, a lot like
views.
being on safari in Africa, you know, very, very comfortable, wonderful food. But it included, you know, sort of like when you're in Africa, you know, they include the game drives. It is sort of similar to that in that they have a whole program of excursions, and kind of depending on, you know, the number of people that want to do this hike or that hike, you know, you head out with a guide and a driver at an appointed time. And so that's what we did on this latest trip. So the first time was really a very dedicated, you know, photography from morning till night trip with a photography guide, wonderful guy from Far South Expeditions named Claudio, who's a birder by training. And our real focus then was photography. Our focus this time was again photography, but I would say it was a little secondary to doing some very nice hikes. But we definitely did photography, kind of along the way.
Yeah, looks like from what you sent me. So, do you actually need a guide, or can you do self-guided, or how does that work?
I would advocate strongly for either a guide or a resort that has transportation for you. There's a lot of nuances. Sometimes weather changes and certain routes are closed temporarily due to high winds. So I think having a rental car there would be a liability. I would definitely opt for either a private guide with the driver or to go with one of these resorts that has a program that'll take you on.
Well, I think the answer to that question kind of depends on exactly how much time you have. So in both of these trips that we did, we were kind of constrained by time, trying to, trying to maximize the relatively limited amount of time we had. And, if you have the luxury of time, that is, say you've got 10 days and are willing to drive yourself. As I mentioned, the distances are considerable. I vividly recall on our first trip, we would be getting up in the dark and we'd be kind of, sleeping in the van while the driver was getting us to and from, our shooting locations. And that's a great luxury, when you're possibly jet lagged, tired from getting up early, from going. So I think one can do it, I would say.
I think it's good to have a plan B and a plan C, though. And with that would come some local, knowledge and a local guide.
Well, in fact, what Steve is alluding to, on our very last day on a recent trip, we headed out with our guide and driver with a plan to do a certain hike on Lake Sarmiento. And we get into the park and the winds were so high that the rangers had closed the trail. So, I think if it had been us, by ourselves, we wouldn't have been able to come up with plan B as quickly as our guide did. So he almost instantly had another idea, just a short drive away. We did a wonderful hike to a very unique and beautiful spot.
Trying to find puma, which
yes.
didn't happen, but there was the high likelihood of puma sighting. So
in other words, that kind of local knowledge, it's a little hard to come by that by yourself in a short amount of time. So I think, I think one could do it on your own. I think very few people have, at least people who are working and sort of constrained by time, I think very few people have that kind of luxury and can make as good a use of the limited time they have without local knowledge. So
that makes sense.
It's doable, some difficulty, I think.
You mentioned the wind both just a minute ago and also in your blog from 2015. So is there a time you can go when the wind isn't as big a factor?
The wind is very important for sculpting the clouds and creating the lenticulars that are so beautiful in the photographs. So I think if it was windless, it would be a very different experience. Mm-hmm. That said, with the winds, I brought my biggest, stoutest tripod, and it still wasn't really enough for some of the things I was trying to do. Basically, longer exposures to calm the water. It was very challenging. So we had to throw basically everything at it. And some of the photos, I don't know the ones we showed you, but some of them are composites to basically try to deal with the tremendous wind and camera motion. It was challenging.
Yeah, the wind is definitely a factor. Like if I had to choose just one word to describe Patagonia, that probably would be the word. That said, the first trip we did was during our winter, their summer, and I think the wind was a near constant presence. In fact, I think out of our 4 shooting days, only once did we have still enough water to actually have really nice reflections of the Torres. And I think that's one of the pictures that I sent you. That said, the second time, which would be in early fall, while the wind was a factor at times, in a general way, it seemed a little more on and off. So, longer periods without terrible winds. We definitely had some. We were like, oh yes, I remember this. Where you're kind of hanging onto your tripod.
When you're out in the open, it could be quite vicious. During some of the hikes, there was a lot more foliage and things to basically cut the wind back. But just to give you an idea, maybe we're hiking into a photo scene, maybe leaning 30 degrees forward and never taking a hand off the tripod when it's set up, because it would have blown over, just to give you an idea how windy it was.
That said,
even with the camera bag on the tripod.
The windiest in our latest trip, the single windiest spot, Steve went up on the highest point of the ridge. He was trying to use an arsenal, to acquire a bunch of sequential images to fuse into a still, seamless water thing. And I think he had a lot more trouble. Where I stayed, kind of lower on the brow of the ridge, I used like a 6-stop neutral density to try to smooth the water a bit. And I didn't really have very much trouble with motion. And I brought my Peak Design, my little travel tripod. I don't want to wrestle with it. I just kind of, worked with what I had, and I probably was less ambitious than Steve was. So, I think there are ways to work around it, but, you might have to accept kind of a nervous looking water, or accept, more post-processing possibly. But it's a spectacular area. And just to be there and see it is well worth the trip.
Yeah. After all the pictures I've seen of there, I certainly have that on my bucket list. So, seasons are reversed there, but I assume that maybe spring and fall are the best times to be there?
Well, thus far, I guess we've experienced summer, which is probably the busiest time in the park, and early fall. We had kind of hoped in our latest trip to have more fall color. It was definitely starting, but I think we were too early. And thinking that April is actually a better choice than late March for fall color. And I hear from our guides there that fall there is absolutely spectacular. I think you also, one advantage of fall is that you have fewer visitors, and the wind is maybe a little bit less intense. That said, even when during our summer trip, we had, on that particular trip, we had done a week in Antarctica and a flight, the shorter one where you just fly to the peninsula and fly back. And we were combining that with a week in Patagonia. And for that particular trip, it was very windy. And I wore literally all the clothes that I had used in Antarctica, almost all the time. So it was that means sometimes like 3 layers on the bottom and 5 on the top, fleece hat, gloves, the full kit. This time around, it wasn't, even though it was fall and in theory should be.
Well, bring layers is.
Yeah, bring layers is the short version. Bring lots of layers, flexible, be ready for rain, for precipitation, for wind, and we used all of those things. But this latest trip was not as intensely cold.
Oh, good. Sound like you froze the first trip.
It was a little chilly sometimes. Yeah.
So, talking about gear, what gear do you recommend bringing as far as camera gear?
It's interesting. After trips, or when I'm going back to the same place, I often look at my images and see what I actually used, because I had the whole camera bag at the time, and sometimes things were happening quickly. And what I saw this time is I was shooting mostly 15 to 30. and 24-70, but mostly on the wide side for both of those lenses. Wildlife, I was shooting my 300, or a lot of people I saw had 80 to 400s out. That was more for the guanaco, the birds, and if we saw puma. The iPhone, actually, it's funny to say, was doing a spectacular job. We have the iPhone 13 Max Pro, and for instance, when you shoot live, it's just a matter of one or two button pushes to get a slow motion blurring of the water from a handheld shot. That was very respectable. So that was quite a nice little tool, especially when we were traveling lighter during the longer hikes.
Yeah, I did the same thing when we were preparing for this trip, and because I've gone to a smaller camera bag, like from a Gura gear that holds like 30 liters.
Yours, I think it's 20.
No, my old one, to down to one that only holds like 22. So it's more ergonomic, and it sort of forces me to make more choices. So I took the same basic camera setup, which was a Fuji X-T4, but I looked back at the images I had from my first trip to kind of, again, see which lenses, which focal lengths I made the most use of. And I ended up using a medium telephoto quite a lot, like a 50 to 140. And I also took, let's see, I'm trying to think I think it's like a 16 to 80, sort of a shorter, again, a sort of a medium telephoto, but I found that I used that quite a lot. If this was because we were really focused on landscape and secondarily on wildlife, I elected not to bring the 100 to 400 because we had done a fair amount of wildlife shooting on our first trip, at which point I didn't even own the 100 to 400 because Fuji hadn't come out with it. So I kind of compromised and brought like a 2X teleconverter to use with the 5140, but unfortunately no Puma decided that they were ready for their close-ups by us. So we didn't have a chance to really use it too much. That was one thing that we learned from our photo guide, Claudio, on our first trip was if you want to see Puma, you kind of have to dedicate the trip to it. In other words, you might get lucky and catch a sighting. We certainly saw lots and lots of signs of Puma predation of guanacos, but it kind of sounded like, if that's your focus, you've got to make it your focus. In other words, really dedicate hours and some long journeys and lots of waiting to shoot and photograph pumas.
As one photo tip, between my first and second trip, one of the things that I did differently and was very helpful is I zoomed out a little bit more with my wide angle. I, of course, like to compose in camera as much as possible. But with my D850 having so many megapixels, I resisted the urge and widened my field of view a bit. And that really helped a lot in post-processing. I had fewer tossers at the end of the trip.
Good to know. So where's the best place to go for pumas, do you think?
Well, in general, at least in the Torres del Paine Park, it's kind of the northeast, just where there's more of the wildlife sightings. I mean, we just saw flocks of guanacos. We saw rheas, which is their kind of version of an ostrich. Although in theory you could have wildlife sightings anywhere, that seems, that's kind of more the open plains, the steppes.
If there are no guanacos, there aren't going to be pumas really. So that's largely, I think, true.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when shooting the Torres, a lot of the landscape and with the lakes, I didn't see many guanacos. So I think you'd have to decide, like Marie said, that you're going to either be doing landscape or going for wildlife and puma.
Okay. Well, speaking of photos, let's take a look at some of yours. And this is a guanaco, pretty obviously, I guess.
Yeah, with a little adornment in its mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty much either eating or milling around or taking dust baths, which can be amusing too.
Although when you see these images from Patagonia of a single guanaco up on a ridgeline, that's usually like a sentry. That's the one that's been posted to keep an eye out for the herd. And it could mean that there's a puma, in the vicinity.
Well, especially if they start vocalizing. But what a crappy job.
Yeah. Well, you might be the survivor, though. So.
Well, I don't know if they post the fastest runner or the loudest vocalizer. I'm not really sure.
The most annoying.
Yeah. So, Steve, do you remember what lens you used for this? Looks like you were pretty close or had a long lens, one or the other.
Yeah, that's probably my 80 to 400, probably more towards the 80 side. I think we were pretty close. This flock was pretty docile.
Well, sometimes kind of like in Yellowstone where the bison, are streaming out on the road. Sometimes you encounter the same kind of situation with guanacos kind of blocking the road, not, usually very transiently,
right.
But so sometimes they're quite close.
Okay, I see. Nice shot. That little flower in there just adds a nice touch, I think. And I'm guessing this is a rhea?
That is a rhea. Easy to mistake for an ostrich. They were far and few, but I think we saw them on both trips.
We did see them on both trips, although I would say we saw them better. On our first trip, we spent more dedicated time looking for wildlife. Mm-hmm. So, you dedicate more time, you generally are going to get, better access and,
sure.
Better photography.
Some other wildlife, which we didn't include in the few that we sent you. Armadillo can be seen, pretty interesting with their little frilly skirts. And fox. We were lucky enough to get fox on our first trip.
Yeah. That is indeed a strange-looking bird.
Pretty big.
And where is this, Steve?
That is...
Well, our guide called this Paine Cascada, which basically means like Paine waterfall.
It's more rapids. It's a gentle waterfall. There actually are a couple, true waterfalls there, which we didn't send you. This one was particularly picturesque because we had the Torres in the background. And this was shot, I think, at 15 to 30. It was a nice lookout point, somewhat guarded from the wind, and very nice place to park very close by. And I calmed the water here with, I think it was a 6-stop Nisi. And I brought the sky down with a graduated.
Actually, that's a comment because one thing that we noticed, so I use breakthrough filters, which are screw-on filters, like for my neutral density, which, like Steve uses the Nisi,
the slide-in rectangular,
which are, in a high wind act much more like a sail. So I think he had a lot more trouble using.
Yeah, good point. It was a little tricky.
Where I didn't have any difficulty at all, as long as I didn't drop it. But,
okay. So all your shooting was done on tripods?
Except for the iPhone?
Pretty much. Well, yes. Yeah, at least of these shots, I would think.
Actually, that said, I'm not promoting a tripod or an iPhone instead of a regular SLR, but if I had a tripod holder for it, it would not have been it would have been a very worthy piece to add to my kit, and I think I'll have it the next time. But yeah, we always had tripods with us.
Well, some of the wildlife you might have shot handheld.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
full shot.
Well, the play of light and shadow. Well, the Tories, they're just majestic, absolutely magnetic. Particularly on our first trip, where we were staying had a terrific view of the Torres, and I literally felt like I couldn't take my eyes off of them, no matter where we were in the park. So this was a sunrise. Obviously, some sunrises are more spectacular than others, so that's kind of the luck of the draw. But this particular morning, was a really lovely play of light and shadow.
Yeah, indeed. And some glacier down here, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Remember what you shot this with, Marie?
Almost certainly, probably in fact, I'm basically certain I used the 50 to 140, and probably toward the 140 in.
Okay. And you're shooting Fuji, so that's micro four thirds?
That's right.
Okay. So actually be double in terms of Nikon or Canon, I guess.
We do get
Approximately, yeah.
Yeah, we do get some extra effective focal length.
Yeah. Okay.
This was our reward after a rather somewhat arduous 9-mile hike with a tricky, slidey, slippery, a little
Last mile
sketchy
or two.
descent.
Yeah, it was steep and full of scree with a stiff wind, but then this appeared.
But this was kind of our reward for doing this hike, was this grand overview of the park. Actually, the conditions, it was a little windy up there, but it wasn't terrible.
Was that iPhone or is that?
No, that's not iPhone.
Huh.
No, that's, I would think I used the 16 to 80. Actually, that's a stitch. That's a stitch.
Yeah.
Probably 4 or 5 shots.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah, very nice. So Tori's back in here, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a grand overview of the park.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's quite a few ways of taking in the Torres, and you'll be getting it from different angles as you're sort of spoking around the formation. So we've seen it in multiple ways with multiple foregrounds, one with tall grasses, several with water, some with water with islands, all different and all spectacular.
Very rarely with reflections and still water. I think the last one I sent you actually is the one still morning we had on our first trip, where the water was actually still enough to get a nice reflection.
Yeah.
But you have to devote a few days and hedge your bets a little bit in order to get still water, quiet wind and reflection there.
So what lakes are these? Do you remember?
That's right in the center of the park. I'd have to look at a map to get the exact name, but it's kind of near Camp Pehoe. There's a couple of places that one could stay that are pretty central. One of them has Pehoe in the name, and I think is a kind of an old, I think maybe a German family owned it. And then there's Explora, which this is taken very close to the Explora property. It's a spectacular area. We actually were kind of re-enjoying it last night. I don't know if you've seen this new nature documentary series that is hosted and executive produced by Barack Obama. It's on Netflix right now, and it's called Our Great National Parks.
Right.
The second program is on Patagonia, and it is spectacular. Well, actually, the entire series is spectacular videography, but that particular segment is devoted to
lots of puma.
Devoted to the Chilean national parks, and particularly focuses on Patagonia, and is a wonderful introduction to the area.
Yeah, I have seen that, and I agree. The photography is spectacular.
Mhm.
couldn't figure out how they took some of those shots they had, but
Neither could we.
Truly.
Well, I'm going to guess they had, a couple of months of dedicated time in the park for
Right.
starters.
yeah, and lots of gear probably.
Lots of gear. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that if people haven't seen that, it's well worth watching for any number of reasons. So check it out, and you'll drool over the photography if nothing else.
It gave me some good ideas of places we haven't been also.
Looked like they had some drone shots, which I'm not sure how they managed to do that.
Yeah, special
Great
permitting
Yellowstone.
Special permission. I
would be
think.
very difficult to get.
Mhm.
And certainly I wouldn't, anybody in our level, just leave your drone at home.
Yeah,
Yeah, we did investigate taking our drone to Chile, and boy, you do have to jump through a lot of hoops. I mean, you can get permission, but it's a do.
Well, even in the
Requiring a
Lake,
lot of advance.
yeah, even in the Lake District, it would be
Oh yeah.
forbidden
Mhm. Well,
and probably confiscated.
helps if your name is Barack, I guess, probably.
that might help.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
So tell everybody where they can find your photos, both of you.
Well, the name of our website is Aperture Photo Arts. So photo spelled with a PH, and aperture, obviously, like the aperture of a camera. So aperturephotoarts.com. And we have a blog and galleries on our website. And we welcome any visitors to it.
Okay. I'll put those in the show notes so people don't have to write it down or look too hard. Well, guys, it's been great fun as usual. Thanks for coming back for a return visit.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Good to see you.
Nice to chat with you.
My pleasure. So each episode of Photographing the West is published on the 15th and 30th of the month. Bye for now, and we'll talk soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.